this series, and we've been talking each week about how Jesus came with the offer of something for this world. John 10:10. Jesus said, I have come that you might have life and have it with abundance. So, we've talked every week about how Jesus promised not just that we would get into heaven when we die. He was the life bringer. He was the kingdom bringer. He said it's now possible for human beings to experience love and joy and peace in the presence of this great God right now, to become fully alive. That's the gospel. It includes the promise of heaven afterwards, but it is not just that. The gospel is not the announcement of the minimal entrance requirements for getting into heaven after you die. It is the offer of life here and now as an act of grace. Now, we've talked about how for a lot of people the reality is that they experience something that falls quite far short of this. It's promised by Jesus. He says, another verse we've talked about almost every week, John 7:38, the one who follows after me, who trusts me, as the scripture say, Jesus says, rivers of living water will flow out of what part of your being? Out of your belly, the old King James says, out of the core of your being will flow streams of energy and strength and ability to deal with life in a kingdom kind of way. But the reality is, for a lot of people, there is this gap. And people are living another kind of life. And they try to do gap management things by working harder and thinking spiritual elbow grease will bridge the gap, or trying to pretend like things are going better than they are, or secretly giving up. We've talked about how Jesus said that available to us, that this business of life isn't about trying harder or about pretending. That these rivers of living water refer to the Spirit. And we've been using kind of a metaphor through this series. In fact, it's the name of this series. This one you should all get. The name of this series is called Flow, because Jesus said the Spirit of God is like rivers of living water that's flowing all the time and is available to flow in you and through you. So Jesus came to announce this gift of life that's available through the Spirit, and to say our primary job isn't really to try harder. It really is just to find out, how do I not get in the way of the Holy Spirit? How do I just keep myself open to, not quenching, not grieving the Holy Spirit from one moment to the next? Okay? And then we've talked about how, as a church, if we start living in this flow, there ought to be some changes in us. And we won't be legalistic or mechanical about this, but 11 times in the New Testament, the writers talk about certain things that'll get put off, like rags. We've been using that acronym, and R stands for resentment, that will put off resentment. And A stands for, everybody real loud, anxiety. We're going to put off anxiety and put on trust. G stands for greed, mismanaged appetites, and S stands for superiority. Okay, I want to say another word tonight about this gap business. I want to elaborate a little bit, because there's something that I'm very concerned about that I think often happens for people who experience this gap between the way that life is really going and the life that's promised. And they know they ought to be living this other kind of life, but it's not happening. Often, this kind of thing goes on over time for Christians now. They will develop what a friend of mine sometimes calls a kind of church life. A kind of church life where they'll do certain things. They'll attend services. They'll avoid maybe certain sins or certain kind of things that would be real scandalous. They'll engage in certain behaviors. They kind of develop a church life so that people will think that their spiritual life is going along okay. But underneath that is their real life. And we've been talking about this in this series, that in our inner beings, like beads on a string, are a series of thoughts and feelings that are going on all the time. And what happens for some people is they get into the church, they become Christians, they've been Christians maybe for a while, they adopt the church life, but inside them, they're experiencing a series of desires and resentments and anxieties and fantasies that are really pretty dark. And they don't want other people in the church to know this, so they keep their real life hidden. They try to manage it. They try not to let it get exposed. Sometimes, if this is a person who's in the church, sometimes there'll be a person outside the church. And the truth is, people in the church kind of envy this guy because he seems kind of free. And they're sometimes a little afraid, because he can go after ambition or pleasure or whatever he wants. That's where the good stuff is. And people in the church think, man, I hope heaven's going to be worth my giving up the good stuff. Sometimes we'll exaggerate how different we are from people outside the church to try to make ourselves feel superior. But inside, in our bellies, in the core of our being, there's this flow of thoughts and feelings that get kind of dark, and desires that grate against us. And what happens every once in a while in churches, what happens periodically is somebody's real life breaks through their church life. And one of these unfulfilled desires that they've been brooding over for a long time, they decide to take action on. And then there's a scandal. Then they do something that creates a scandal. And that's a real sad thing. But I think the saddest thing is what's been going on year after year in the real life of that person, in their mind, in their heart, that just makes them miserable. And makes them try to do scandal avoidance or sin management. And live with a church life that maybe they make look pretty good, but a real life that's really pretty miserable. And I want to tell you, and this is at the core of this series, Jesus Christ did not come just to bring a church life. Jesus came to bring life, the real thing, the good stuff. His gospel is the good stuff. It is life right here, right now, and forever after in heaven. Now, I'd like to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18. We've been talking about this kind of life that Jesus comes to bring, living in the flow, putting off resentment and putting off anxiety and putting off mismanaged appetites. But tonight we're going to deal with an issue that folks who have a church life sometimes wrestle with, and in some ways, I think, is the hardest rag to put off of all, and it's superiority. So Luke chapter 18, starting with verse 9. Luke 18, verse 9. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, God, I thank you I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus adds this, I tell you that this man, tax collector, rather than the other one, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, it's critical for us to understand this story, to notice in verse 9 who the audience is. Take a look again at verse 9. To some, and then this remarkable statement, who were confident of their own righteousness, they knew they were righteous, and looked down on everybody else. Now, of course, part of what Jesus came to do was to redefine what actual righteousness is. And at the heart of authentic righteousness, as Jesus came to explain it, is a heart that genuinely loves God and loves people. That's the essence of righteousness. That's the bottom line of righteousness. And here are people who are quite confident of their own righteousness and don't love anybody and look down on everybody else. So what we're getting into here is a misunderstanding of righteousness, which is unbelievably important for anybody who wants to pursue spiritual growth. When people get righteousness wrong, it is deadly. Now, this group of people, the crowd would have been larger than that. There'd be lots of different people in the crowd, but it contains these folks who are self-righteous. These are people who had power and respectability. They were looked up to by other folks as spiritual giants, and that's how they thought about themselves. And they held in contempt the very outcasts and rejects and spiritual zeros that Jesus kept giving himself to and hanging out with. And this dynamic, this sense of superiority, of self-righteousness, this dynamic, you go through the Gospels, this one drew sharper rebukes from Jesus than any other sin. An awful lot of other sinners flocked to Jesus. Self-righteous people did not flock to Jesus. You ever notice that? People that were guilty of real bad sexual sin, financial sin, and so on, they flocked to him. The Bible never says, and then self-righteous people flocked to Jesus. So, Jesus deliberately tells a parable in a public setting where the character who represents the spiritual giants turns out to be the villain, and the guy who looks like the spiritual zero turns out to be the hero. Understand, this is not a pleasant little story that Jesus tells using a flannel graph. This is a gauntlet thrown in the face of a very powerful group of religious leaders. Jesus is looking for some serious trouble in this story. And you don't get this story unless you can feel the tension becoming unbearable in the room as Jesus tells it. The spiritual giants in this audience are getting so offended that they're ready to kill him. And one day they would, for stories like this, for stories like this. Spiritual zeros in the crowd, on the other hand, the sinners, they're listening to Jesus with open mouths. I can't believe he's saying this. Can you believe he's saying this? Tax collectors in the crowd, as many as there might have been, tax collectors in the crowd, when Jesus tells this story, they're going nuts. A story where the tax collector is not the butt of the joke, isn't the bad guy? Unbelievable. Jesus is telling a story where the tax collector is a hero. Nobody tells a story where the tax collector is a hero. It's like the Cubs winning the World Series. No wonder I love this guy, they're all thinking. Now, why does Jesus do this? Why does he get so ruthlessly into the face of the most powerful people of his day? Well, I'll tell you why. I think it's because when we come to superiority, when we come to the tail end of the rags that we're supposed to put off, when we come to superiority, we are dealing with a problem that is uniquely difficult for human beings to recognize in themselves. In themselves. It's a funny thing. I've been thinking about this a lot this week. People go see therapists and pastors every day for anger problems. They know that resentments can destroy their relationships, and people feel so guilty for the way that they just lash out. People go to counseling offices every day who suffer from anxiety and fear because they're dying inside and they know it. They're desperate for help. Greed, mismanaged desires, and addictions bring millions of desperate people to a choice between life and death every day. Millions of desperate people into 12-step groups where they're ready to dump out every sordid detail of their lives every day because they know they're on a road to death. Every one of these problems that we've been talking about, resentment, anxiety, mismanaged impulses, every one of them have treatment centers and research programs devoted to overcoming them. And people buy books and attend classes and listen to tapes by the truck road and go to teachers and humble themselves to help themselves with these problems because they're desperate. Here's what's interesting. I have never known a pastor or a therapist, I've never known anybody who had one single person come to them and say, I need help with my pride problem. I know of no Betty Ford treatment center for the insufferably arrogant. Which is too bad, isn't it? Couldn't our world use one or two of those? Betty Ford Treatment Center for the insufferably arrogant. Don't you know a few folks you'd like to have go to that? Tell you what I think. I think if there were such a place, then some of the people who need it most might not just be Hollywood celebrities or Washington power brokers. Sometimes maybe it would include some of us who call ourselves Christians. Maybe. Who can so easily start to lament that the rest of society just can't be as morally upright and pure as we are. See, one of the biggest problems with superiority, with judgmentalism, is that the people suffering from it don't know they're suffering from it. That's why Jesus attacks it with such brutal honesty in this story. But the sting gets lost over the centuries. I thought about this too. This is quite ironic to me. The majority of contemporary Christians in our day read this parable, and you know what most of them say? They say, thank God I'm not like that tax collector, like that Pharisee. Thank God I'm not like that Pharisee who said, thank God I'm not like the tax collector. Contemporary Christians read this story and think, that Pharisee thought he had to earn his way into God's favor, but I'm smarter than him. My theology is right. Thank God I'm superior to that guy who thought he was superior to everybody. Maybe that Pharisee has a little more to teach us than we think he does. So, let's put ourselves in the place of Jesus' listeners for a moment. In the first place, the people listening to Jesus would hear something totally different in the word Pharisee than we would. They would hear a totally different word. In our day, Pharisee has become synonymous with self-righteousness and hypocrisy, and we all tend to get quite judgmental about the Pharisees for being too judgmental. To get the point of Jesus' story, you have to erase what you think you know about Pharisees. To Jesus' listeners, Pharisee was a very good word. Even in the Gospels, everything we hear about the Pharisees is not bad. Turn back a couple of pages to Luke 13. We'll come back to Luke 18. Turn back a couple of pages to Luke 13:31. In Luke 13, Jesus' life is being threatened by Herod Antipas, a very, very violent, aggressive, impulsive ruler. And he's after Jesus. What I want you to notice, this is quite remarkable. Notice who it is that comes to Jesus' rescue. Luke 13:31. At that time, Herod Antipas is after him. Some Pharisees come to Jesus and said to him, leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you. Now we know enough about Herod Antipas to know that if he's after an enemy of his, and that enemy gets tipped off and gets away, eludes him, Herod Antipas is going to want to know who tipped this guy off. At considerable risk to themselves, the group of people that intervenes to save Jesus' life is who? It's a group of Pharisees. That's a remarkable passage. Nicodemus, who sought Jesus out as a teacher, was a leading Pharisee. Jesus himself, of course, often criticized the behaviors of many among the Pharisees. We don't know what the percentages were, but he would criticize the behavior of many. But this is what Jesus said about their teaching. I won't take the time to turn there, but you can make a note of this reference and look at it later if you'd like to. Matthew 23, 2 and 3, Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 and 3. Jesus said, the Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses, so you must obey them and do everything they tell you. Now, from Jesus, that's quite a remarkable commendation of their teaching. Matthew 23. So, if we're going to benefit from this story, it will never work for you and me to start with a judgmental attitude towards the Pharisee. This is a person who Jesus' listeners would have sincerely looked up to. This is a good word. It's not a bad word. Tax collectors, on the other hand, were despised as corrupt traders. In our day, if you wanted to put this in modern terms, it would have the feel something like a story about a Peace Corps volunteer and a drug dealer who go into a church to pray. Would have that kind of flavor to it. Another detail that we need to know. When Jesus says these two men go up to the temple to pray, it would have sounded a bit different to his listeners than it tends to us. We tend to think about that as a private devotional experience. They went up to pray on their own. His listeners would have understood Jesus to be referring to the time of the daily sacrifice. It was offered once in the morning at about 9, once in the late afternoon at about 3, when many, many people would go to the temple to observe the sacrifice of atonement, and then at a certain time they would pray, and they would do this out loud, and it would be a public act. In other words, this is not a private devotional deal. This is a public service. The actions and words of these two men would have taken place in full view of all the people gathered together in the temple. This is a public deal. So Jesus says, Pharisee and tax collector go to the temple for the daily sacrifice. Priest goes in, kills the sacrificial calf, goes outside the holy place, or goes inside the holy place to burn incense. And at that point, when the incense rises, that was kind of a symbol of the prayers of God's people rising to heaven. So that would be the time when the people would pray, and they'd pray out loud. In their culture, they'd pray out loud. Jesus says the Pharisee stands up and starts to pray, and the phrase that Jesus uses can be translated about himself in verse 11. That's how it's translated in my translation. A guy named Ken Bailey says probably the best translation of this phrase is the Pharisee stood up to pray by himself. In other words, he separates himself from the masses of the people because, since he is a Pharisee, if he were to touch, get bumped into by anybody in the crowd who is ritually unclean, that would defile him. He's a holy man. So he separates himself. He prays by himself. And everybody sitting there would say, of course, this is a holy man. Now, usually at this point in the service, it was customary for the sinners, like this tax collector, to be led outside the temple area to stand at the eastern gate in this part of the service. Customarily, that's what happened. For some reason on this day, that did not happen. And these defiled people, these sinners, like this tax collector, is allowed to hang around. And the Pharisee doesn't like that. So he does an interesting thing with his prayer. And what he does is not just reserved to people in the first century. Have you ever heard somebody who technically is praying out loud, but you can tell they're really just using prayer as an excuse to send a message to somebody else who's listening? You ever experienced that kind of thing going on? Oh, God, help my husband, who is listening right now, even as you and I speak, to have victory over his selfish and inconsiderate ways, and to buy a really nice gift for me for Mother's Day, which, as you know, oh Lord, is on layaway for me at Nordstrom's, even now. Not really talking to God. Bill Moyers was Lyndon Johnson's press secretary during the 60s, and he was praying one time before a meeting, cabinet meeting, and LBJ said to him, because he was praying kind of quietly, "Speak up, Bill, I can't hear you." And Moyers said, "That's okay, Mr. President, I wasn't really talking to you." Okay? Pharisee's not really talking to God. He decides to use this prayer as an opportunity to instruct the unrighteous people around him. Now notice at this point how his sense of superiority is cutting him off from the flow. It's cutting him off from God. He's not really in contact with God. Thinks he is, he's not. He offers a parody of a prayer. Jewish prayers were generally either expressions of thanksgiving for gifts that God had given to them or petitions for need. And this guy says, "God, I'm so glad I'm not like all other men. Thanks that I'm not a robber, I don't steal. I'm not an evildoer. I'm not an adulterer. I'm not like this tax collector here." You ever find yourself deliberately searching for flaws in another human being? You ever find yourself kind of hoping you can pass judgment on somebody? It's a strange thing. This is uniquely a problem, particularly a problem, this business of superiority, for people who pursue faith and virtue. Superiority is a problem for people of faith in a way that's kind of unique compared to resentment and anxiety and fear and appetites and so on. Because when I try to do something that I think is good, it's a real short step from me looking at myself and saying, what a noble thing I'm doing. How come other people can't be more like me? Sometimes it happens in just goofy little ways. Let's say I'm working on an appetite problem. I'm a big macaholic, and I go on a diet, and for 2 days I eat really well, but I'm kind of cranky about it. And I walk into McDonald's, and I get the garden salad. And I see people around me eating quarter pounders and Big Macs and supersized fries. And I start thinking, what's the matter with these people? How can they eat all this stuff? Don't they have any self-control at all? Just collections of appetites, worshiping at the golden arches? What is wrong with these people? Even though I was eating the same stuff yesterday, and I'll probably be eating it again tomorrow. And there's a lot of stuff I don't think about when I start passing judgment, for whatever reason. I don't think about the person that I'm judging as maybe having had a more difficult background that I've had. I don't think about the fact that I might have had a whole lot of kind of spiritual, emotional, personal assets on my side that they never had. I don't think about their genetic predispositions and that they might be battling wiring problems that I don't battle. I don't think about 1,000 other ways in which they're far more virtuous, much better people than I am. I just focus on this one area, and then I get all self-righteous. What a noble thing I'm attempting to do. How come other people can't be more like me? See, the Pharisee is not really praying at all. He is saying these words publicly. This is part of the darkness in this story. He is saying these words publicly so they can be heard by as many people as possible, and he is deliberately humiliating this tax collector. And he's doing this because it makes him feel good to have thoughts like that. He looks at this tax collector. His life looks pretty good right now. And it makes him feel a little stab of joy inside to think, I'm better than that guy. I'm more pleasing to God. That feels good. He keeps comparing himself to this guy. Not only does he not like him, not a robber and evildoer. He says, I fast twice a week. That's an interesting statement. According to Leviticus 25:29, Israelites were required by law to fast only one time a year on the Day of Atonement. This guy fasts 2 times every week. Those of you who are math majors, about how many times a year would that be? Take a wild guess. Yeah, about 104. Okay? He's like doing serious extra credit work, this guy. And he says, I tithe on everything I get. According to the Old Testament, tithing was to have been already observed on wine, grain, and oil by those who produced it, by the farmers and so on. And so it wasn't necessary when you would acquire these goods to tithe, because they'd already been tithed. But he goes ahead and tithes on them anyhow. And then he pays an additional tithe on anything else that comes into his possessions. Other products, other types of produce, in that era, they were not required to tithe on certain things for whatever reason, like celery. You didn't have to tithe celery. I'm not making that up. I guess they figured even God doesn't like celery. Nobody wants celery, so you don't have to tithe on it. This guy, he tithes on everything. Stuff that should have been already tithed on, he does that anyhow. Stuff you don't even have to tithe on, he's tithing on it. He's not just observing the law, he's doing serious extra credit work. And he uses the low spiritual reputation of the tax collector to make himself feel better. He didn't have to. Here's what he could have done. He could have seen that tax collector with all these people around in the temple, and he could have run over to him and thrown his arms around him and said, man, I'm so glad you're here. What a great choice for you to make. To come to the temple. To be reminded during this service that we serve and follow a merciful God, a sin-forgiving, gracious God. What a great choice you made. I'm so glad you're here. Because you know what? You and I, we're just a couple of guys who need God's mercy. That's what we are. And I'll make you a deal. I'll pray for you. You pray for me. This atonement thing, that's going on for us. And he could have opened the door of everybody's heart in that community wide open for this tax collector. Could have been a vessel of grace. And if the Spirit was flowing in his life, as the Spirit's available every moment to you and to me, that's the kind of thing that the Spirit prompts somebody to do. But he didn't do it. He didn't do it. Cal, he didn't do it because he was too devoted to his own stupid pride. And it just made him feel kind of good inside. It sounds better than that. Self-righteousness, judgment. Jesus goes after this stuff harder than anything else because it cuts me off from the flow of the Spirit like nothing else. Because it puts me in the center of my universe. Because it prompts me to violate love. You know, a lot of the sins of the appetite, I mean, they're bad, they're devastating, they wound souls. But people sometimes pursue gluttony or other sins of the appetite and are still capable of a certain kind of love. Pride is utterly, completely incompatible with love. It is like the opposite of love. The irony here is that this Pharisee thinks he's praying, he thinks he's pleasing the Spirit of God. You know, people who are full of resentment, where anger is just flowing out of them like lava, people who are anxious and scared and don't trust God because they're afraid, so they disobey Him, people who have all kinds of addictions and impulse control problems, they at least know that they got problems. They generally know they're in serious spiritual trouble. But if you ask this Pharisee, how's your spiritual life going? What do you think he'd say? He's great. My spiritual life is great. I went to the temple today. I was praying. God is so pleased. I'm fasting. I'm tithing. I'm doing extra credit work. My spiritual life is tremendous. And the reality is, he was sinning the whole time. He was attacking another person. He was violating love. He was damaging community. He was poisoning his soul. And he didn't even know. He didn't have a clue. His church life looked really good to him and other people around him, but his real life, that was a mess. His real life was a mess. And what matters to Jesus and what matters to the Father is your real life, is your real life. So let me ask you, do you have any of that Pharisee in you? Do you ever find yourself passing judgment on someone? You ever get a little twinge of joy out of being critical? You ever find out somebody else messed up and feel a little superior? But you just look at this really honestly. Some time ago, I was talking to my sister Barbie, who knows me very well. And I was talking about somebody who I know quite well. She knows somewhat. And I was talking about this person in a very judgmental way. Just expressing all kinds of anger and indignation over this person's character flaws. And she made a really interesting comment to me. She said, a friend told me that when we feel really judgmental towards someone, it's often because at some level we envy them. When we're really judgmental, often at some level there's envy going on. And I said, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. I didn't say that. I just said, ouch. Because I have a big share of this Pharisee in me. It is so easy for me to go to that place. And I'm just very aware right now of real fresh times of doing that. Other character in this story is a tax collector. And tax collectors were universally hated in Israel for good reason. They were collaborators with Rome. Israel was occupied by an enemy, and tax collectors sold out their own people for a profit to their people's enemy. And they were understood to be quite corrupt. There's an ancient city that actually built a statue to an honest tax collector because it was such an unusual thing. This tax collector, we're told, stood at a distance. He separated himself from the people, but not for the same reason as the Pharisee. He did it because he was aware of what was inside of himself. And he knew he was kind of dangerous to other people. And his awareness of his own fallenness and brokenness produced a deep humility in him. It says he wouldn't even look up to heaven. Heaven is often a Jewish way of speaking about God, and the idea behind the fact that he wouldn't look up there is, we'll sometimes say, if somebody's really brazen, not only do they do something wrong and tell you they've done something wrong, they look you right in the eye. We'll say, how can you look me in the eye and say that? How can you not at least have the decency to hang your head? Well, the tax collector can't bring himself to look God in the eye, heaven in the eye. Not because he mistrusts God's goodness, but because he's not glib and brazen about his fallenness. It's too deep for that. Jesus goes on to say in verse 13, this next phrase, wouldn't look up to heaven, but beat his breast. This is an extraordinary act. The breast was the part of the body that was regarded as particularly significant in ancient times because it housed the heart. And so it was considered the location of that which is truest and deepest in you. That's the core. And it still has that flavor to us. We have friends whose daughter, when she was about 5 years old, was very excited about Jesus and finding out about and following after Jesus. And she said to her parents one time, I know Jesus lives in my heart because when I put my hand on it, I can feel him walking around in there. It's kind of a cool image, isn't it? Walking around in there. The act of beating on the breast was an expression of extreme anguish. It was never done in the Old Testament, not mentioned there once. It's recorded only twice in the New Testament. Once is here. The other time is at Golgotha during the crucifixion of Jesus. Then people beat their breasts. The tax collector is making a cry of desperate agony here. My heart's wrong. I'm wrong at the deepest level. My heart's wrong. Not somebody else's. Not yours. Not yours. Mine. I don't know the truth about anybody else's heart. The reality is, I can only see a tiny little bit about any other person. I have access only to my own mind, to my own secret thoughts and desires. And sometimes they frighten me. I hear about a classmate of mine from college who was higher on the achievement ladder than that I was. And he's recently gone through a scandal. It's kind of messed up. And although it violates every value I profess to hold, inside me, somewhere there's this little twinge of satisfaction that someone I considered a rival now cannot pass me up. That's in my heart. I get a very clear prompting. Don't say that. It is self-serving. Its only goal is to promote yourself. Don't say that. I say it anyway. I get mad at somebody. And I find, without even wanting to, in my imagination, I'm having this conversation, this fantasized conversation, where I make these real brilliant, bold statements and arguments that make the other person just crumple up in guilt and shame. Anybody here ever do that kind of thing in their imagination? But then in real life, I may say nothing at all and just live with that inner resentment. Because it's easier to do that, or because I'm afraid. of things like that go on in my heart, sometimes worse things. See, that's why following Jesus will never lead anybody to superiority, because you wrestle with stuff in your heart, and it may be those things, or it may be something else that's dark, but that's just the truth about us. That's who we are. And there's only one person whose depravity I have full access to, and that's mine. That's why superiority is so lethal. It blinds me to the truth about myself. And then I'm not able to repent, and then I'm not able to love. But here's what I'm learning, and this is where the good news comes in. All I have to do when I have some dark thought along the way, all I have to do when I recognize it is do what the tax collector did. Just stop and say the tax collector's prayer. Here's the tax collector's prayer. God, I'm a mess. God, I'm a mess. Not the whole truth about me, but it is the truth about me. And if you don't remember anything else from this message, then it'd be a good thing to remember that prayer, because you'll need it sometimes. So let's say it together with some conviction, like you really mean it. On the count of 3. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. God, I'm a mess. Okay? And every once in a while, just make sure you get the pronoun right. It's God, I'm a mess, not God, you're a mess to somebody else. Okay? It's just this is about me. Have mercy. I need help. God, have mercy on me. And God will say, I know all about you. And there's the Spirit right there with you. And there's another wave. There's another wave. There's another wave. There's another wave. You just get right back into the flow. You get right back into the flow. That's grace.